The rain hammered against the windshield of my Toyota Camry as I pulled into the parking lot of Henderson's Consignment shop, a place I'd driven past 1,000 times but never thought to enter. The wipers squeaked against the glass in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Fast, irregular, anxious. I was here because my lawyer, Patricia Mendez, had mentioned seeing something that might interest me. Something about a wedding dress that looked familiar. Something that made her think of me. Creating this detailed story took us considerable time and effort to research and narrate properly. If you're finding value in this journey of justice and family betrayal, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who might relate, and subscribe to our channel for more compelling true stories. I should have known then. I should have felt it in my bones, the way you feel a storm coming before the first clouds gather. But grief has a way of dulling your instincts, and I'd been drowning in it for 3 months now, ever since the accident, ever since the lawsuits started flying like vultures over carrion. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, a sweet, innocent sound that seemed to mock the heaviness in my chest. The shop smelled of lavender sachets and old fabric, that particular scent of other people's memories waiting to be claimed by strangers. Rows of clothing hung like ghosts of celebrations past, prom dresses in outdated cuts, men's suits that had seen better decades, children's outfits that someone's babies had outgrown. "Can I help you find something, dear?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Henderson herself, a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain. She'd owned this shop for 30 years, had seen the town of Millfield change from a farming community to a bedroom suburb of the state capital. She'd watched young couples come in searching for affordable formal wear, had witnessed the recycling of dreams through fabric and thread. "I'm looking for a wedding dress," I said, my voice catching slightly. "My lawyer said she saw one here that reminded her of me." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of recognition crossing her weathered features. "Oh," she said softly, and in that single syllable, I heard everything I needed to know. "You must be Sarah Mitchell?" My maiden name. I hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 2 years, not since I'd become Sarah Chen when I married David. Not since I'd chosen love over the bitter arguments that had defined my relationship with my mother for so long. The name felt foreign now, like a coat that no longer fit. "Yes," I whispered, though part of me wanted to run, to pretend I'd never come here at all. Mrs. Henderson nodded toward the back of the store, where the formal wear hung in a separate section. "It's back there, dear, the ivory one with the cathedral train, Belgian lace overlay, hand-beaded bodice, beautiful workmanship." My legs felt like water as I walked toward the formal section. Each step echoed in the quiet shop, mixing with the sound of rain against the windows and the tick of an old grandfather clock in the corner. I passed a mirror and caught a glimpse of myself. 32 years old but looking older, my dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, my brown eyes rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. I looked like a woman who'd been fighting battles on multiple fronts and losing most of them. And then I saw it. My wedding dress hung there like an accusation, like a question I wasn't prepared to answer. The ivory silk shimmered under the fluorescent lights, the hand-beaded bodice catching and reflecting the light in tiny starbursts. The cathedral train, which had required 3 bridesmaids to carry during my wedding ceremony, pooled on the floor like spilled cream. Every detail was exactly as I remembered. The sweetheart neckline, the delicate buttons running down the back, the way the Belgian lace overlay created subtle patterns across the skirt. But it wasn't just seeing the dress that made my knees buckle. It was the price tag hanging from the sleeve. $800. $800 for a dress that had cost me $3,000, a dress I'd saved for 8 months to buy, a dress I'd worn once on the happiest day of my life. "How long has this been here?" I asked Mrs. Henderson, who had followed me to the back of the store. "About 2 weeks now," she replied carefully. "A woman brought it in, said it belonged to her daughter who wouldn't be needing it anymore." The words hit me like physical blows. Wouldn't be needing it anymore. As if my marriage to David was already over. As if the accident that had claimed his life had somehow erased the love we'd shared, the vows we'd spoken, the life we'd built together in our small house on Maple Street. Did she say why her daughter wouldn't need it? The question tasted bitter in my mouth. Mrs. Henderson looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with her glasses chain. She said there had been some difficulties, legal troubles, that her daughter was in a bad situation and needed to liquidate assets. Liquidate assets. The clinical phrase my mother would have learned from her own lawyer, the one she'd hired to contest David's will, to argue that his life insurance policy should go to his parents rather than to me. The same legal terminology that had become the language of my grief, reducing love to property and memories to monetary value. I reached out and touched the dress, my fingers recognizing the texture of the fabric, the weight of the beadwork. I remembered standing in the bridal shop with my maid of honor, Jessica, both of us crying as I tried on dress after dress until we found the one. I remembered the way David's face had looked when I walked down the aisle of St. Mark's Episcopal Church, the way his eyes had filled with tears, the way he'd mouthed "beautiful" as I approached him at the altar. "I'd like to buy it," I said suddenly. Mrs. Henderson blinked in surprise. "Buy it? But dear, if this is your dress—" "It is my dress," I said firmly. "And I want to buy it back." The transaction felt surreal, like something happening to someone else. I wrote a check for $800. Money I could barely afford. Money that should have gone toward groceries, or the mortgage payment that was already 2 weeks late. But I needed to reclaim this piece of my life, this symbol of the happiness that my mother seemed determined to erase. As Mrs. Henderson carefully wrapped the dress in tissue paper and placed it in a large garment bag, I felt something shift inside me, a recognition that I'd been fighting this battle all wrong. "Mrs. Henderson," I said as she handed me the garment bag, "the woman who brought this in, did she leave her name?" "Of course, dear. We require identification for all consignments." She consulted her ledger book, running her finger down a column of names. "Here it is. Margaret Mitchell. She left a phone number too in case we had any questions about the item. Margaret Mitchell, my mother, the woman who had raised me to believe that love was conditional, that family loyalty could be bought and sold, that survival meant looking out for yourself first and always. The woman who had refused to attend my wedding because she didn't approve of David's prospects, who had told me I was making a mistake marrying a public school teacher instead of the lawyer or doctor she'd always envisioned for me. The same woman who had shown up at David's funeral 3 months ago, not to comfort me in my grief but to inform me that she intended to contest his will. The woman who had hired Thomas Garrett, one of the most expensive probate attorneys in the state, to argue that David's life insurance policy should be distributed according to state law, rather than the beneficiary designation he'd made. The woman who had forced me to sell the house she'd left me in her will, the house I'd grown up in, the house that held every memory of my childhood, just to pay Patricia Mendez enough to fight her legal challenge. I walked out of Henderson's consignment shop carrying my wedding dress like a flag of war. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy with clouds, pregnant with the promise of more storms to come. I placed the garment bag carefully in the back seat of my car, making sure it lay flat, protecting it as I should have protected it from the beginning. As I drove home through the familiar streets of Millfield, past the elementary school where David had taught 4th grade for 6 years, past the library where we'd had our first date, past the coffee shop where he'd proposed on a snowy February morning, I felt the weight of all the battles I'd been fighting. The legal battle with my mother, the financial battle to keep David's house, our house, while paying attorney fees, the emotional battle to grieve a husband while defending the legitimacy of our love to lawyers and judges who saw only dollar signs and legal precedents. But now there was something else, a mystery that demanded answers. How had my mother gotten into my house to take my wedding dress? I'd changed the locks after David's death, had given keys only to Jessica and to my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, David's aunt, the woman who had become more of a mother to me in 2 years of marriage than my own mother had been in 32 years of life. The house on Maple Street looked exactly as I'd left it that morning, the yellow Victorian cottage that David had bought as a bachelor and that we'd slowly transformed into a home together. The white picket fence he'd painted last spring, the garden where I'd planted roses in memory of him, the front porch where we'd spent summer evenings talking about our dreams for the future. Children, travel, growing old together. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the house that had become both sanctuary and prison. Inside were all the reminders of the life I'd lost, David's coffee mug still sitting in the sink because I couldn't bring myself to wash it, his books still scattered on the coffee table, his clothes still hanging in our bedroom closet. But inside, apparently, there were also signs of invasion. Evidence that my mother had been here, had walked through the rooms where David and I had lived and loved, had taken pieces of our life to sell like unwanted furniture. I carried the garment bag up the front steps, my keys jingling in the evening air. The lock turned smoothly, no signs of forced entry. I stepped inside and immediately felt it, the displacement that comes when someone has been in your space without permission. Nothing obvious, nothing a stranger would notice. But I could sense it in the way the living room felt, in the subtle wrongness of familiar surroundings. I hung my wedding dress in the front closet and began to search. It didn't take long to find evidence of my mother's presence. In the bedroom, the jewelry box David had given me for our first anniversary sat slightly askew on the dresser. Inside, I discovered that my grandmother's pearl necklace was missing, the one David had insisted I wear on our wedding day, the one that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. In the guest room that we'd hoped to turn into a nursery someday, I found that the antique quilt my great-grandmother had made was gone. In the kitchen, the set of china we'd received as a wedding gift from David's parents, the one we'd used for every holiday and anniversary, had been reduced by half. Subtle thefts, things that might not be noticed immediately by a grieving widow, things that could be explained away or denied. But the wedding dress had been the bridge too far. Perhaps my mother had thought I wouldn't find it, wouldn't think to look in a consignment shop across town. Perhaps she'd assumed I was too broken by grief and legal battles to notice one more thing missing from my life. Perhaps she'd simply stopped caring about subtlety, had decided that since she was already fighting me in court, she might as well help herself to whatever she thought she deserved. I sank onto the couch in the living room, surrounded by the ghosts of my marriage and the evidence of my mother's betrayal. The grandfather clock in the corner, another wedding gift, chimed 9 times, marking another day in the strange limbo that had become my life. Outside, the rain had started again, drumming against the windows like fingers tapping impatiently, waiting for answers I wasn't sure I was brave enough to seek. On the coffee table, David's last book lay open to the page he'd been reading the night before the accident. To Kill a Mockingbird, he'd been preparing a lesson plan about justice and moral courage for his students. I touched the page gently, remembering how passionate he'd been about teaching, how he'd believed that education could change the world one child at a time. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, facing my own moment of moral courage, my own test of justice. My mother had invaded my home, stolen my possessions, and was simultaneously trying to steal my husband's legacy through the courts. She'd forced me to sell the house where I'd grown up to pay lawyers to fight her legal challenges. And now she was literally selling the symbols of my happiness piece by piece, like she was dismantling my life one memory at a time. But I had resources she didn't know about. I had Patricia Mendez, who had seen my wedding dress in that consignment shop and had cared enough to tell me about it. I had Mrs. Chen next door, who watched over me like a guardian angel and who might have seen something, noticed something. I had Jessica, who had been my maid of honor and who knew every detail of my wedding day, who would understand exactly what it meant to find my dress for sale, like a discarded costume. Most importantly, I had something my mother had never possessed: the absolute certainty that comes from being truly loved. David had loved me unconditionally, had seen me at my worst and chosen me anyway, had built a life with me based on trust and mutual respect. That love hadn't died with him in the accident. It lived on in the house we'd shared, in the memories we'd created, in the legal documents he'd carefully prepared to protect me after his death. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Patricia's number. It was late, but this couldn't wait until morning. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the hour. "Sarah, is everything okay?" "I found the dress," I said. "It was mine. My mother sold it." A pause. Then, "How did she get access to your house?" "I don't know yet. But Patricia, if she took the dress, what else has she taken? What else is she planning to take?" "We need to document everything," Patricia said immediately. "Take pictures of what's missing, check bank accounts and credit reports, change all your locks again. And Sarah, we need to have a conversation about filing charges. This isn't just a civil matter anymore." Filing charges. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. It was one thing to fight my mother in probate court over David's insurance policy. It was another thing entirely to have her arrested for theft, to turn a family dispute into a criminal matter. But as I sat in the house where David and I had planned to grow old together, surrounded by evidence of my mother's systematic betrayal, I realized that the family I'd been trying to protect no longer existed. Perhaps it never had. Perhaps what I'd always thought was complicated love was actually something much simpler and much uglier: manipulation, control, and greed. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the streets clean, preparing the ground for whatever would grow in the aftermath of this storm. I closed David's book gently, marking his place with a bookmark I'd given him last Christmas, and stood up to begin documenting the theft of my life. Tomorrow, I would call the police. Tomorrow, I would begin fighting back in earnest. But tonight, I would sit with my reclaimed wedding dress and remember what it felt like to be loved completely, to be chosen without conditions, to be part of something beautiful that no amount of money or legal maneuvering could ever truly take away. The clock chimed 10 times, and I realized I wasn't just counting the hours until morning. I was counting down to the moment when I would stop being a victim and start being a fighter. My mother had made a mistake when she stole my wedding dress. She'd given me something more valuable than anything she'd taken: absolute clarity about who she really was, and who I needed to become. I woke the next morning to the sound of my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. The caller ID showed Jessica's name, and I could imagine her face, worried, probably pacing around her kitchen with her coffee growing cold, the way she did when she was anxious about something. "I've been thinking about you all night," she said without preamble when I answered. "Ever since you texted me about the dress. Sarah, I can't stop thinking about your wedding day. About how radiant you looked. About how David cried when he saw you walking down that aisle." I sat up in bed, my body protesting the movement. I'd slept poorly, haunted by dreams of my mother rummaging through my house like a burglar, taking pieces of my life and selling them to strangers. The morning light streaming through the bedroom windows felt harsh, unforgiving, illuminating the empty spaces where David's presence used to fill the room. "Jess, I need to ask you something," I said, my voice still rough with sleep. "Do you remember everything about that day? Every detail?" "Are you kidding?" "I was your maid of honor. I remember the way you couldn't stop shaking when I was buttoning up your dress, how your hands were trembling so badly that I had to help you with your lipstick. I remember how your mother—" She stopped abruptly. "What about my mother?" A pause. Jessica had always been diplomatic about my relationship with my mother, had tried to find the silver lining in even the darkest clouds. But we'd been best friends since college, and she'd witnessed enough family dinners and holiday disasters to know the truth about Margaret Mitchell. "She wasn't there, Sarah. She refused to come to your wedding because she said David wasn't good enough for you. She said you were throwing your life away on a man who would never be able to provide for you properly. She said teachers don't make real money, that you'd regret it when you wanted nice things, when you wanted to travel or buy a decent house or send your kids to good schools." The memory came flooding back. The phone call 3 weeks before the wedding, my mother's voice cold and final. "I won't watch you make the biggest mistake of your life, Sarah. When this marriage falls apart, don't come crying to me." I'd hung up on her that day, had cried for hours in David's arms, had wondered if she might be right, if love really was enough to build a life on. "But David proved her wrong, didn't he?" I said softly. "We were happy, we had a good life." "You had a beautiful life," Jessica agreed. "And your mother was wrong about everything. David adored you. He would have moved mountains for you. And the way he looked at you. God, Sarah, I used to be jealous of how much that man loved you." I got out of bed and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where David had planted sunflowers the spring before he died. They were tall now, their heavy heads following the path of the sun across the sky, bright and hopeful despite everything that had happened. He'd planted them because he knew they were my favorite, because he'd wanted me to have something beautiful to look at every morning when I woke up. "Jessica, I think my mother has been planning this for a long time," I said. "The legal challenge to David's will, the theft from my house. I think she's been waiting for him to die so she could prove she was right about our marriage." "What do you mean?" I told her about Patricia's theory, about the systematic nature of the missing items, about the way my mother had used my maiden name when she sold the wedding dress. As I spoke, I could hear Jessica's sharp intake of breath, could picture her face growing pale with understanding. "She's trying to erase him," Jessica said finally. "She's trying to erase your marriage, like it never happened. And if she wins the legal challenge to his insurance policy, if she succeeds in proving that our marriage was somehow invalid or temporary, then she'll have retroactively been right about everything. She'll have her vindication and David's money." I made coffee in the kitchen, going through the motions of a normal morning routine while my mind raced through possibilities and connections. David's coffee mug still sat in the sink where I'd left it months ago, a blue ceramic cup with "World's Best Teacher" printed in white letters. His students had given it to him for Teacher Appreciation Day, and he'd used it every morning since, claiming it made his coffee taste better. The sight of it filled me with the familiar ache of loss, but also with something fiercer: determination. My mother wanted to erase David from my life, wanted to reduce our love to a legal technicality, but she'd underestimated what she was fighting. She'd underestimated the depth of the roots David and I had grown together, the strength of the foundation we'd built. I called Patricia Mendez at exactly 9 o'clock, as soon as her office opened. Her secretary put me through immediately, and I could hear the rustle of papers, the sound of a busy law practice gearing up for another day of battles. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night," Patricia said. "I think we need to expand our strategy. Your mother's theft of personal property might be the key to undermining her credibility in the probate case." "How so?" "Think about it, Sarah. She's arguing in court that your marriage to David was a mistake, that you're not entitled to his insurance benefits because you're somehow an unfit or undeserving beneficiary. But at the same time, she's stealing the symbols of that marriage: your wedding dress, your jewelry, your wedding gifts. It's contradictory behavior that suggests her real motivation isn't legal principle, but personal greed." I walked through the house as we talked, taking inventory of what was missing, trying to remember every gift, every heirloom, every meaningful object that had made this place a home. In the living room, I noticed that the silver picture frame that had held our wedding photo was gone, though the photo itself lay abandoned on the side table, as if my mother couldn't bear to look at David's face even while she was stealing from us. "There's something else," I told Patricia. "I want to understand how she got into the house. I changed the locks after David's death, and I only gave keys to Jessica and Mrs. Chen next door. We need to talk to both of them. And Sarah, I think it's time to involve the police. This isn't just a family dispute anymore." After I hung up with Patricia, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, making lists. Items stolen, possible entry methods, people who might have information. As I wrote, memories surfaced unbidden, not just of the missing objects, but of the moments they represented. The pearl necklace had been David's grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of Chen women. David had insisted I wear it on our wedding day, had fastened it around my neck himself, while I sat at the vanity in the bridal suite at the church. "Now you're truly part of the family," he'd whispered in my ear, his breath warm against my neck. The antique quilt had covered our bed for the first year of our marriage, until we'd moved it to the guest room to preserve it for special occasions. David's great-grandmother had pieced it by hand during the Great Depression, using scraps of fabric from worn-out clothes and curtains. Each square told a story of making do, of finding beauty in necessity, of love expressed through patience and skill. The china set had been a wedding gift from David's parents, chosen specifically because it matched the pattern David's mother had inherited from her own grandmother. We'd used it for every holiday dinner, every anniversary celebration, every time we'd wanted to make an ordinary meal feel special. David had always insisted on washing it by hand, claiming that the dishwasher would damage the delicate gold rim. These weren't just possessions my mother had stolen. They were connections to David's family, symbols of the acceptance and love they'd shown me from the moment David brought me home to meet them. They were proof of my place in the Chen family tree, evidence of the roots I'd grown in David's life. My mother had never understood that kind of love. Her own marriage to my father had been transactional, a merger of 2 middle-class families seeking upward mobility. When he died of a heart attack during my senior year of college, she'd grieved not the loss of a soulmate but the loss of financial security and social status. She'd thrown herself into managing his life insurance payout and his pension benefits with the same ruthless efficiency she now brought to challenging David's will. The doorbell rang at 11 o'clock, startling me out of my memories. Through the peephole, I saw Mrs. Chen standing on the front porch, carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing the concerned expression that had become familiar over the past 3 months. "I brought you some lunch, dear," she said when I opened the door, "and I wanted to check on you. You looked upset when you came home last night." Mrs. Chen was David's aunt, his father's younger sister, but she'd become a surrogate mother to both of us during our marriage. She was 68 years old, a retired librarian who had never married but who had devoted her life to caring for everyone else's children. She'd taught David to cook Chinese dishes when he was growing up, had helped him with his homework when his parents were working late, had been the one to suggest he pursue teaching because she recognized his gift with children. "Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you something important," I said, accepting the casserole dish and leading her into the living room. "Have you seen anyone around the house while I've been at work? Anyone who shouldn't have been here?" Her expression grew troubled. "Why do you ask, dear?" I told her about the missing items, about finding my wedding dress at the consignment shop, about my suspicions regarding my mother. As I spoke, Mrs. Chen's face grew increasingly concerned, her hands clasping and unclasping in her lap. "I did see someone," she said finally. "About 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. A woman in a dark sedan parked in your driveway. I assumed she was a friend or relative, someone you'd given permission to be there. She had keys." "What did she look like?" "Older woman, maybe in her 60s. Gray hair, well-dressed. She was carrying boxes out to her car, like she was helping you move things or clean things out. I thought maybe it was related to your legal situation, maybe you were having to sell some belongings to pay for the lawyers." "My mother. It had to be. But how had she gotten keys?" "Mrs. Chen, did you ever give anyone a copy of your key to my house?" She shook her head firmly. "Never. I take that responsibility very seriously. The only time I've used that key was when you asked me to water your plants while you were visiting Jessica in Chicago last month." "May? There's something else," I told Patricia. "I want to understand how she got into the house. I changed the locks after David's death, and I only gave keys to Jessica and Mrs. Chen next door. We need to talk to both of them. And Sarah, I think it's time to involve the police. This isn't just a family dispute anymore." After I hung up with Patricia, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, making lists. Items stolen, possible entry methods, people who might have information. As I wrote, memories surfaced unbidden, not just of the missing objects, but of the moments they represented. The pearl necklace had been David's grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of Chen women. David had insisted I wear it on our wedding day, had fastened it around my neck himself, while I sat at the vanity in the bridal suite at the church. "Now you're truly part of the family," he'd whispered in my ear, his breath warm against my neck. The antique quilt had covered our bed for the first year of our marriage, until we'd moved it to the guest room to preserve it for special occasions. David's great-grandmother had pieced it by hand during the Great Depression, using scraps of fabric from worn-out clothes and curtains. Each square told a story of making do, of finding beauty in necessity, of love expressed through patience and skill. The china set had been a wedding gift from David's parents, chosen specifically because it matched the pattern David's mother had inherited from her own grandmother. We'd used it for every holiday dinner, every anniversary celebration, every time we'd wanted to make an ordinary meal feel special. David had always insisted on washing it by hand, claiming that the dishwasher would damage the delicate gold rim. These weren't just possessions my mother had stolen. They were connections to David's family, symbols of the acceptance and love they'd shown me from the moment David brought me home to meet them. They were proof of my place in the Chen family tree, evidence of the roots I'd grown in David's life. My mother had never understood that kind of love. Her own marriage to my father had been transactional, a merger of 2 middle-class families seeking upward mobility. When he died of a heart attack during my senior year of college, she'd grieved not the loss of a soulmate but the loss of financial security and social status. She'd thrown herself into managing his life insurance payout and his pension benefits with the same ruthless efficiency she now brought to challenging David's will. The doorbell rang at 11 o'clock, startling me out of my memories. Through the peephole, I saw Mrs. Chen standing on the front porch, carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing the concerned expression that had become familiar over the past 3 months. "I brought you some lunch, dear," she said when I opened the door, "and I wanted to check on you. You looked upset when you came home last night." Mrs. Chen was David's aunt, his father's younger sister, but she'd become a surrogate mother to both of us during our marriage. She was 68 years old, a retired librarian who had never married but who had devoted her life to caring for everyone else's children. She'd taught David to cook Chinese dishes when he was growing up, had helped him with his homework when his parents were working late, had been the one to suggest he pursue teaching because she recognized his gift with children. "Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you something important," I said, accepting the casserole dish and leading her into the living room. "Have you seen anyone around the house while I've been at work? Anyone who shouldn't have been here?" Her expression grew troubled. "Why do you ask, dear?" I told her about the missing items, about finding my wedding dress at the consignment shop, about my suspicions regarding my mother. As I spoke, Mrs. Chen's face grew increasingly concerned, her hands clasping and unclasping in her lap. "I did see someone," she said finally. "About 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. A woman in a dark sedan parked in your driveway. I assumed she was a friend or relative, someone you'd given permission to be there. She had keys." "What did she look like?" "Older woman, maybe in her 60s. Gray hair, well-dressed. She was carrying boxes out to her car, like she was helping you move things or clean things out. I thought maybe it was related to your legal situation, maybe you were having to sell some belongings to pay for the lawyers." My mother. It had to be. But how had she gotten keys? "Mrs. Chen, did you ever give anyone a copy of your key to my house?" She shook her head firmly. "Never. I take that responsibility very seriously. The only time I've used that key was when you asked me to water your plants while you were visiting Jessica in Chicago last month. Within hours, the transformation was remarkable." Miguel's breathing normalized, his skin clearing as the crystallization reversed. Throughout São Benedito, people who had been dying began to recover, their bodies healing from the bioweapons damage. Even the town's plants began to regenerate, drawing strength from the orchid's gift. Colonel Mitchell watched in amazement as her superior's orders to sterilize the area became impossible to justify. The miracle of São Benedito would change everything, proving that nature held solutions beyond human imagination, and that sometimes the most powerful weapons against darkness were flowers that chose to heal rather than harm. Elena stood in her greenhouse, surrounded by regenerating plants and the soft glow of the Esperanza's descendants. The woman they'd called Flower Girl had helped save not just her town but potentially the world. And in the distance, she could hear the sound she'd missed most. Children playing in the square, their laughter mixing with birdsong as life returned to São Benedito. Last month, when I'd been gone for 4 days, attending Jessica's birthday celebration and trying to escape the suffocating weight of grief and legal battles, when I'd asked Mrs. Chen to collect my mail and keep an eye on the house. Did anything unusual happen while I was gone? Anyone call or come by? Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There was a phone call," she said slowly. "Someone claiming to be from your lawyer's office, asking if I had keys to your house. They said there were some documents that needed to be retrieved urgently. Something about your legal case. I told them I couldn't let anyone in without your permission, but they were very insistent, very professional sounding." The pieces began to fall into place. My mother had impersonated someone from Patricia's office, had tried to get Mrs. Chen to give her access to the house. When that failed, she'd found another way. But how? "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to ask you to do something that might seem strange. I want you to think very carefully about that week while I was gone. Did you lose your keys at any point, even briefly? Did you leave them anywhere, or did anyone have access to them?" She closed her eyes, concentrating. "I went to the grocery store on Tuesday," she said slowly, "and to the library on Wednesday. I always keep my keys in my purse, but..." She paused, her eyes opening wide with realization. "The library. I was checking out books, and my purse was on the counter. I had to go back to the stacks to find a book I'd forgotten, and I left my purse there for maybe 5 minutes. There was another woman there, using the copy machine. She could have seen my keys, could have… What did she look like? Gray hair, well-dressed, about my age, maybe a little younger. Mrs. Chen's face went pale. "Oh, Sarah, do you think she copied my key?" It was entirely possible. My mother was intelligent, resourceful, and had plenty of motivation. She could have followed Mrs. Chen to the library, could have made copies of the keys while Mrs. Chen was distracted. It would have given her access to my house at any time, would have allowed her to take whatever she wanted while I was at work, or dealing with legal appointments. "Mrs. Chen, this isn't your fault," I said firmly. "You couldn't have known. But I need to ask you another favor. I need you to be a witness for me. I need you to tell the police and my lawyer exactly what you've told me." She nodded without hesitation. "Of course, dear. David was like a son to me. And you're like a daughter. I won't let anyone hurt his memory or take advantage of your grief." After Mrs. Chen left, I called Patricia again and relayed what I'd learned. She listened without interruption, asking clarifying questions and taking notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, this changes everything," she said finally. "We're not just dealing with theft anymore. We're dealing with breaking and entering, identity theft, fraud. Your mother committed multiple felonies to steal from you. This gives us enormous leverage in the probate case." "Pace? What do you mean?" Think about it from a judge's perspective. Here's a woman who's arguing in court that her daughter's marriage was illegitimate, that her daughter doesn't deserve her deceased husband's insurance benefits. But at the same time, she's breaking into that daughter's house and stealing the very wedding dress she claims represents a meaningless union. She's stealing family heirlooms that she claims her daughter has no right to possess. I felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. You think this will make her drop the legal challenge? I think this will make her realize that she's about to lose everything. Her reputation, her freedom, possibly her own assets if we pursue a civil case for damages. Smart money says she'll want to settle quickly and quietly. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that I didn't want her to settle quickly and quietly. I wanted her to face the consequences of what she'd done. I wanted her to understand that love wasn't a commodity to be bought and sold, that marriage wasn't a business transaction that could be dissolved by greed and manipulation. I wanted her to know that David's love for me was real, permanent, and stronger than any legal challenge she could mount. I spent the afternoon going through photo albums, gathering evidence of the stolen items, documenting the life my mother was trying to erase. Pictures from our wedding day showing me wearing the pearl necklace, David's grandmother's jewelry bright against my dress. Photos from our first apartment, the antique quilt spread across our bed like a promise of continuity and tradition. Images from holiday dinners, the china set gleaming on our dining room table, filled with food we prepared together and shared with friends and family. Each photograph was a small act of resistance, proof that our love had been witnessed, celebrated, and honored by people who understood its value. My mother could steal objects, could challenge legal documents, could even force me to sell property to pay for lawyers. But she couldn't steal the memories these photographs preserved, couldn't erase the evidence of happiness that glowed from David's face in every image. As the sun set behind the sunflowers in our garden, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would file a police report. I would press charges for breaking and entering, for theft, for all the crimes my mother had committed in her quest to prove that my marriage had been a mistake. But tonight, I would honor David's memory by wearing my wedding dress one more time. I would put on the pearl necklace I'd bought back from the consignment shop, would stand in the garden he'd planted for me, would remember what it felt like to be loved completely and without conditions. My mother had sold my wedding dress because she thought it represented something temporary, something disposable. She was about to learn that some things are worth more than money, and that love, real love, doesn't have a price tag. Detective Maria Santos arrived at my house the next morning, carrying a well-worn notebook and an expression of professional skepticism that softened as I told my story. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every variation of family dysfunction that existed. "I've seen cases like this before," she said, settling into David's favorite armchair in the living room. "Adult children fighting over estates, families turning on each other when there's money involved. But this level of systematic theft, the planning required to copy keys and impersonate legal professionals, that suggests something deeper than ordinary greed. I showed her through the house, pointing out the empty spaces where my possessions had been, the subtle signs of intrusion that had taken me days to notice. Detective Santos photographed everything, measured rooms, dusted surfaces for fingerprints. She was thorough in a way that made me feel taken seriously for the first time since this nightmare began. "The wedding dress is interesting," she said as we stood in the bedroom where the empty jewelry box sat on my dresser. "It's not something with obvious resale value, not compared to jewelry or electronics. It's personal, symbolic." That's what I thought too, like she was trying to erase my marriage, piece by piece. Detective Santos nodded. "We see that sometimes in domestic disputes. Someone trying to rewrite history, to prove they were right about a relationship by destroying evidence of its happiness." She closed her notebook and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Chen, I have to ask, are you prepared for what comes next? Pressing charges against a family member, especially a parent, that's not something you can take back easily." The question hung in the air between us. Was I prepared? 3 months ago, I would have said no. 3 months ago, I still believed that family bonds were sacred, that love could overcome any obstacle, that my mother's coldness toward David was just a phase she'd eventually outgrow. But that was before she'd refused to attend his funeral. Before she'd hired Thomas Garrett to challenge his will while I was still numb with grief. Before she'd broken into my home and stolen the symbols of the love she'd always claimed was worthless. "I'm prepared," I said firmly. She made her choice when she decided to profit from my husband's death. Detective Santos spent 2 more hours at the house, interviewing Mrs. Chen, photographing the consignment shop receipt I'd saved, documenting the timeline of events. When she left, she promised to have arrest warrants ready within 48 hours. "One more thing," she said as she reached the front door. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay for the next few days? Once we serve these warrants, your mother might escalate her behavior. People don't like being backed into corners." I assured her I'd be fine, but her words echoed in my mind long after she'd driven away. My mother had already proven she was capable of planning elaborate schemes, of impersonating legal professionals, of breaking into my home. What else might she be capable of if she felt desperate enough? That afternoon, Patricia called with news that made my stomach clench with anxiety and anticipation. "I've been in contact with Thomas Garrett," she said, "your mother's attorney. I informed him about the criminal charges you're filing, and he's requested an emergency meeting with his client. I suspect they're going to want to negotiate." "What kind of negotiation?" "The kind where she drops her challenge to David's will in exchange for you not pursuing the criminal charges. It's a common strategy when someone realizes they've overplayed their hand." But I'd been thinking about this all day, weighing options and consequences, and I'd reached a different conclusion. "Patricia, what if I don't want to negotiate? What if I want her to face the full consequences of what she's done?" A pause. "Sarah, I understand your anger. What she did was unconscionable. But criminal trials are expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. And there's always the risk that a jury might see this as a family dispute rather than serious crimes. But if she gets away with this, what message does that send? That she can steal from me, violate my home, try to destroy my marriage's legacy, and face no real consequences as long as she backs down when caught?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "You're right," she said finally, "and there's something else to consider. If we let her off the hook now, what happens the next time she decides she knows better than you about your life? What happens if you remarry someday or inherit something else she thinks she deserves?" The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was watering David's sunflowers when a silver Mercedes pulled into my driveway, and Thomas Garrett himself stepped out. He was exactly what I'd expected. Tall, impeccably dressed, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. He looked like the kind of lawyer who charged $800 an hour and considered it a bargain. "Mrs. Chen," he said, approaching me with the calculated smile of a man accustomed to getting his way, "I wonder if we might have a conversation. Anything you want to say to me, you can say through my attorney." Of course. But I thought perhaps we might discuss a resolution that would benefit everyone involved. A way to put this unfortunate situation behind us without the need for criminal proceedings. I set down the watering can and looked at him directly. Mr. Garrett, your client broke into my home and stole my possessions. She committed multiple felonies in service of a civil case that was already ethically questionable. What exactly do you think we have to negotiate? His smile faltered slightly. Mrs. Chen, your mother is a 70-year-old woman with no criminal history. A judge is going to see this as a family dispute that got out of hand, not a serious criminal matter. But the publicity, the strain on your family relationships, surely you don't want to put everyone through that. My family relationships? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mr. Garrett, my mother refused to attend my wedding. She refused to attend my husband's funeral. She spent the last 3 months trying to prove that my marriage was illegitimate so she can steal his life insurance money. What exactly do you think I'm protecting? Thomas Garrett shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to dealing with people who couldn't be intimidated or manipulated. She's prepared to drop her challenge to your husband's will, he said. Complete withdrawal, no appeals, no further legal action. In exchange, you agree not to pursue criminal charges. And my stolen property? She's prepared to make full restitution for any items that may have been inadvertently removed from your home. Inadvertently removed. As if my wedding dress had somehow accidentally found its way to a consignment shop. As if the systematic theft of my most precious possessions had been some kind of honest mistake. Mr. Garrett, please tell my mother that I'll see her in court. Both courts, criminal and civil. And you can tell her that every day she prolongs this fight is another day I have to document just how calculated and premeditated her actions have been. He left without another word, his expensive car disappearing down Maple Street like a snake retreating to its hole. I finished watering the sunflowers, their bright faces turned toward the morning sun, and felt something shift inside me. For months I'd been playing defense, reacting to my mother's attacks, trying to protect what little I had left. But now I was ready to go on the offense. I called Jessica and asked her to meet me for lunch. We went to Rossetti's, the Italian place where David and I had celebrated our first anniversary, where the owner still asked about him every time I came in. Mrs. Rossetti had known David since he was a child. He'd been one of her son's classmates, and she'd cried when I told her about the accident. You look different, Jessica said as we settled into a booth in the back. Stronger, somehow. I told her about Detective Santos's visit, about Thomas Garrett's attempted negotiation, about the decision I'd made to see this through to the end. As I spoke, I watched Jessica's expression change from concern to admiration, to something that looked almost like pride. I remember when we first met your mother, she said when I finished. Freshman year, parents' weekend. She spent the entire time criticizing your major, your friends, your clothes, your weight. She made you cry 3 times in one day, and when I asked you why you let her talk to you like that, you said it was because she loved you and wanted what was best for you. I believed that then. But you don't now. I thought about it, really considered the question. I think she loves the idea of me, the daughter who would validate her choices, who would marry someone she approved of, who would live the life she thinks is worth living. But she doesn't love me. She doesn't even know me. And David did. David loved me exactly as I was. He loved my stubbornness, my independence, my refusal to be what other people wanted me to be. He loved that I chose him over my mother's approval, and he never made me regret that choice. Jessica reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Then fight for that, Sarah. Fight for the love you had, for the marriage you built, for the life you chose. Don't let her rewrite your history. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called David's parents in San Francisco, where they'd moved after his father's retirement. We'd spoken briefly after the funeral, but I'd been too overwhelmed by grief and legal battles to maintain regular contact. Now, I needed them to know what was happening, needed them to understand what my mother was trying to take from all of us. Sarah, sweetheart, Mrs. Chen said when she heard my voice. We've been so worried about you. How are you holding up? I told them everything. About the legal challenge to David's will, about my mother's break-in and theft, about finding my wedding dress for sale like a discarded costume. As I spoke, I could hear Mrs. Chen's sharp intakes of breath, could imagine her and Mr. Chen sitting in their San Francisco apartment, holding hands the way they always did when they were upset or worried. That necklace belonged to my grandmother, Mrs. Chen said when I mentioned the missing pearls. She wore it on her wedding day in 1923, when she married my grandfather in a ceremony that lasted 3 days because it was the first Chinese-American wedding their community had ever celebrated. I gave it to David specifically so he could give it to you, so it would become part of your family's history. I'm going to get it back, I promised, all of it. And I'm going to make sure she faces consequences for what she's done. Good, Mr. Chen said firmly. David loved you more than life itself. He would want us to protect you the way he can't anymore. Whatever you need, money for lawyers, someone to testify about David's character, anything, you just have to ask. Their unconditional support was like a balm on wounds I hadn't even realized were still bleeding. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Protective, nurturing, accepting. This was the family I'd chosen when I married David, the family that had embraced me without reservation or conditions. The arrest warrants were served on Friday morning. Detective Santos called to tell me that my mother had been taken into custody at her apartment, that she'd been charged with breaking and entering, theft, fraud, and identity theft. Bail had been set at $50,000. She hired a different lawyer, Detective Santos told me, someone who specializes in criminal defense, and she posted bail within 2 hours. What happens now? Now we build the case. I've got the evidence from your house, statements from you and Mrs. Chen, documentation from the consignment shop. The DA's office thinks we have a strong case, but they want to be thorough. That afternoon, Patricia called with more news. Thomas Garrett has withdrawn as your mother's counsel in the probate case. Professional conflict of interest, he says. Now that she's facing criminal charges related to the same matter, she's going to have to find new representation. What does that mean for the timeline? It means delays. New lawyers need time to get up to speed, to review all the documents and depositions. We're probably looking at several more months before this gets resolved. Several more months of uncertainty, of fighting, of having my life dissected by lawyers and judges. But also several more months for the truth to emerge, for the full scope of my mother's actions to be documented and understood. That evening, I sat in David's garden, watching the sunflowers turn their faces toward the setting sun. The house felt different now, not just violated, but somehow purified by the truth. The police had lifted fingerprints from surfaces my mother had touched, had documented every missing item, had treated my home like the crime scene it actually was. My phone rang just as the last light was fading from the sky. The caller ID showed my mother's number, and for a moment I considered not answering. But I needed to hear her voice, needed to understand what she thought she could possibly say to justify what she'd done. Sarah. Her voice was controlled, careful, the way it got when she was trying to manage a situation she couldn't quite control. I think we should talk. I think you should talk to your lawyer. This has gotten out of hand. I never intended for things to go this far. You broke into my house and stole my wedding dress. You stole David's grandmother's necklace, our wedding gifts, our family heirlooms. What exactly did you intend? A pause. I intended to help you move on, to help you realize that clinging to the past wasn't healthy. You're young, Sarah. You could start over, find someone better suited to you, build a real life, instead of mourning a mistake. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. A mistake. That's what she called the love that had defined the best years of my life. The marriage that had made me happier than I'd ever thought possible. David wasn't a mistake, I said quietly. He was the best thing that ever happened to me, and you're gonna face the consequences of trying to destroy that. Sarah, I'm your mother, I love you, I've always wanted what was best for you. No, you've always wanted what you thought was best for your image. A successful daughter married to a successful man, living a life that would reflect well on your parenting, but I chose love over your approval. And you couldn't forgive me for that. I hung up on her the way I should have hung up on her years ago, the way I should have hung up on her the day she refused to attend my wedding. But I'd been trained from childhood to accept her disapproval as love, to interpret her control as care, to believe that her toxic version of family was the only version that existed. David had shown me a different way. His family had taught me that love didn't come with conditions, that acceptance didn't require perfection, that family meant supporting each other through difficult times rather than profiting from them. As I sat in the growing darkness, Surrounded by the flowers David had planted and protected by the home we'd built together, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for his insurance money or even for justice. I was fighting for the right to define my own life, to honor the love we'd shared, to refuse my mother's version of who I should be and how I should grieve. The battle was far from over. There would be court dates and depositions, cross-examinations and legal fees, months of having my life scrutinized by strangers. But for the first time since David's death, I felt like I was fighting from a position of strength rather than reacting from a place of grief and confusion. My mother had stolen my wedding dress thinking it was just fabric and beads, something temporary and disposable. She was about to learn that some things become more valuable when you try to destroy them, and that love, real love, doesn't have an expiration date. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a gray Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after my mother's arrest. The courthouse smelled of industrial cleaning products and decades of human drama, its marble floors echoing with the footsteps of lawyers, defendants, and families caught in the machinery of justice. Creating this detailed story took us considerable time and effort to research and narrate properly. If you're finding value in this journey of justice and family betrayal, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who might relate, and subscribe to our channel for more compelling true stories. I arrived early with Patricia, both of us carrying folders thick with evidence, photographs, receipts, witness statements, and documentation of every item my mother had stolen. Detective Santos met us at the entrance, looking professional in her dark suit, her notebook tucked under her arm like a weapon. "Your mother's new lawyer is Robert Finch," she told us as we walked through security. "He's good, expensive, experienced in high-profile criminal defense. He's going to argue that this is a civil matter disguised as criminal charges, that family disputes don't belong in criminal court." "What's our counter-argument?" Patricia asked. "That crime is crime, regardless of family relationships. That breaking and entering doesn't become less illegal when it's committed by a parent against a child." We took our seats in the courtroom, and I felt the weight of the moment settling over me like a heavy coat. 3 months ago, I'd been a grieving widow trying to navigate probate court and insurance claims. Now I was the victim in a criminal case, preparing to testify against the woman who'd raised me. My mother entered the courtroom 20 minutes later, flanked by Robert Finch, and looking smaller than I remembered. She'd always been a formidable presence in my life, tall, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of controlled authority that came from decades of managing other people's expectations. But today she looked diminished somehow, older, wearing a conservative navy suit that made her skin appear pale and drawn. She didn't look at me as she took her seat at the defendant's table, but I could feel the tension radiating from her posture, the careful way she held herself, as if any sudden movement might shatter the composure she'd spent a lifetime perfecting. Judge Rebecca Morrison called the court to order promptly at 9 o'clock. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every variation of human behavior and wasn't impressed by any of it. I'd researched her background, 20 years as a prosecutor before being appointed to the bench, known for being fair but tough, especially in cases involving family violence or exploitation. "This is a preliminary hearing in the matter of State versus Margaret Mitchell," Judge Morrison announced. "The defendant is charged with breaking and entering, theft in the first degree, fraud, and identity theft. Mr. Patterson, you may present the state's case." Assistant District Attorney James Patterson was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the eager intensity of a prosecutor building his reputation on high-profile cases. He'd spent 2 hours with me the previous week, going over my testimony, preparing me for the questions Robert Finch would inevitably ask. "Your Honor, this case involves a systematic campaign of theft and deception carried out by the defendant against her own daughter," Patterson began. "Over a period of several weeks, Mrs. Mitchell unlawfully entered her daughter's home and removed valuable personal property, including wedding gifts, family heirlooms, and items of significant sentimental value. She then sold these items for profit while simultaneously pursuing a civil case designed to claim her deceased son-in-law's life insurance benefits." He called me as the first witness, and I walked to the stand on legs that felt unsteady, my hand trembling slightly as I placed it on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The courtroom felt enormous from the witness chair, filled with strangers who would judge not just my mother's actions but my decision to prosecute them. Patterson led me through my testimony carefully, establishing the timeline of events, the evidence of break-in, the discovery of my possessions at the consignment shop. I spoke about finding my wedding dress for sale, about the systematic nature of the thefts, about the emotional impact of having my home violated and my memories commodified. Mrs. Chen, can you describe your relationship with your mother prior to these events? I paused, choosing my words carefully. It was complicated. My mother didn't approve of my marriage to David. She refused to attend our wedding and had very little contact with us during the 2 years we were married. After David's death, she hired a lawyer to challenge his will, claiming I wasn't entitled to his life insurance benefits. And how did that legal challenge affect you financially? I had to sell the house my mother had left me in her will, the house I grew up in, to pay attorney fees to defend against her claims. A murmur ran through the courtroom. I saw several jurors. This was still just a preliminary hearing, but potential jurors were observing, shift in their seats, their expressions changing from neutral curiosity to something more engaged. Patterson walked me through the evidence methodically, the missing jewelry, including David's grandmother's pearl necklace, the antique quilt that had been handmade by his great-grandmother, the wedding china we'd used for every special occasion. Each item represented not just monetary loss, but the erasure of my connection to David's family, the systematic destruction of the life we'd built together. Mrs. Chen, why did you decide to press criminal charges rather than simply pursuing a civil remedy? I looked directly at my mother as I answered. Because what she did wasn't just theft. It was an attempt to rewrite history, to prove that my marriage was meaningless by literally selling off its symbols. It was a calculated campaign to force me to accept her version of my life, regardless of what I wanted or needed. Robert Finch's cross-examination was exactly what I'd expected. Aggressive, personal, designed to make me look vindictive and unstable. He questioned my motives, suggested I was using criminal charges as leverage in the civil case, implied that a grieving widow might be confused about what was missing and when it had disappeared. Mrs. Chen, isn't it true that you were heavily medicated for depression following your husband's death? I was prescribed anti-anxiety medication to help me sleep. It didn't affect my ability to inventory my own possessions. And isn't it true that you've been under enormous financial pressure, that you've been struggling to pay your bills and legal fees? Yes, because I've had to defend my husband's will against frivolous challenges. Frivolous? Mrs. Chen, your mother was simply exercising her legal rights to contest what she believed was an improper distribution of assets. My mother was trying to profit from my husband's death while claiming our marriage was a mistake. Finch pressed harder, questioning my memory, my motives, my credibility. But I'd prepared for this, had spent hours with Patterson practicing answers, learning to stay calm under hostile questioning. Every attack only reinforced the central truth. My mother had committed crimes, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that fact. Mrs. Chen took the stand next, her testimony clear and devastating. She described seeing my mother removing boxes from my house, described the phone call from someone impersonating my lawyer's office, described how her keys could have been copied at the library. Her quiet dignity and obvious reluctance to be involved in family conflict made her testimony particularly powerful. I loved David like a son, she said when Patterson asked about her relationship with our family, and I love Sarah like a daughter. What Margaret Mitchell did was unconscionable. She violated not just Sarah's home, but her grief, her right to mourn in peace. Detective Santos testified about the evidence, about the systematic nature of the thefts, about the planning required to copy keys and impersonate legal professionals. She'd clearly done her homework, presenting a timeline that showed premeditation and calculation rather than impulsive family dispute. In my 15 years as a detective, I've seen many family conflicts that escalated to property disputes, she testified. But this level of planning, the systematic nature of the thefts, the impersonation of legal professionals, this goes far beyond a family disagreement. These are serious crimes that happen to be committed by a family member. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. David's father had flown in from San Francisco, despite his arthritis and his fear of flying, to testify about the stolen family heirlooms. "That pearl necklace belonged to my grandmother," he said, his voice shaky with age and emotion. "She wore it when she married my grandfather in 1923, when Chinese immigrants weren't even allowed to become citizens. She passed it to my mother, who wore it at her wedding. My mother passed it to my wife, who wore it at ours. We gave it to David specifically so he could give it to Sarah, so she would know she was truly part of our family." He looked directly at my mother as he continued. "For someone to steal that necklace, to sell it like it was worthless costume jewelry, that's not just theft. That's the destruction of family history, the erasure of love and tradition and acceptance." I saw my mother flinch when he said this, saw her carefully maintained composure crack slightly. For a moment, she looked like what she was, a bitter old woman who had destroyed something beautiful because she couldn't bear to see her daughter happy in a way she'd never been. Robert Finch's defense was predictable but professionally executed. He argued that this was a civil matter, that family disputes over property didn't belong in criminal court, that my mother had acted out of concern for my welfare rather than criminal intent. "Margaret Mitchell is a 70-year-old woman with no criminal history," he argued. "She's a mother who was worried about her daughter's financial situation, who believed she was helping by removing items that could be sold to pay legal bills. Her methods may have been misguided, but her intent was not criminal." He called character witnesses, neighbors, former colleagues, members of my mother's church, who testified about her involvement in charity work, her reputation in the community, her devotion to helping others. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign to present her as a pillar of the community who had made a mistake in judgment, rather than a criminal who had systematically violated her daughter's home and trust. But Patterson's rebuttal was devastating. He presented phone records showing that my mother had researched the consignment shop before stealing my wedding dress, had called multiple times to ask about their procedures and pricing. He showed credit card records proving she'd purchased lock-picking tools and key-copying equipment online. He presented evidence that she'd hired a private investigator to monitor my daily routine, to determine when I would be away from home. This wasn't a concerned mother helping her daughter, Patterson argued. This was a calculated criminal campaign designed to force Mrs. Chen to abandon her legal rights and accept Mrs. Mitchell's version of how she should live her life. The most damaging evidence came last. Patricia had subpoenaed my mother's financial records as part of the civil case, and those records told a story that undermined everything her defense had claimed. Mrs. Mitchell didn't steal her daughter's possessions to help with legal bills, Patterson explained to the court. She stole them to pay her own legal bills. The money from the consignment shop, the jewelry, the wedding gifts, all of it went directly to pay Thomas Garrett's fees for challenging her son-in-law's will. The revelation sent a shock through the courtroom. My mother hadn't been trying to help me at all. She'd been funding her attack on David's will by stealing and selling our possessions, had been literally using our love against us to finance her legal assault on our marriage. I watched my mother's face as this evidence was presented, saw the moment when she realized that her careful facade had finally crumbled completely. She wasn't a concerned parent or a grieving grandmother-in-law. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman so consumed by her need to be right that she'd committed multiple felonies to prove her point. Judge Morrison took a brief recess before announcing her decision. I sat in the hallway with Patricia and Detective Santos, trying to process everything I'd heard, everything that had been revealed about the woman who'd raised me. "She planned it all," I said quietly, "every detail, the key copying, the timing, the research about where to sell my things. This wasn't impulse or concern. This was revenge." "The judge is going to bind this over for trial," Patricia predicted. "The evidence is too strong, and the financial records show clear criminal intent." When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Morrison's expression was grim. "After reviewing the evidence presented today, I find probable cause to believe that the defendant committed the crimes with which she is charged. This matter will be bound over for trial in Superior Court." She looked directly at my mother as she continued. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want to be very clear about something. The fact that the victim in this case is your daughter doesn't make your alleged actions less serious. It makes them more serious. Family relationships create trust, and when that trust is violated for personal gain, It represents a particularly egregious form of betrayal. As the court adjourned, my mother finally looked at me. For just a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped completely, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been regret. Or it might have been hatred. At that point, I wasn't sure there was much difference. Robert Finch approached Patricia in the hallway as we gathered our papers. "My client would like to discuss a plea agreement," he said quietly. "Perhaps we can resolve this without the expense and publicity of a trial." "What did you have in mind?" Patricia asked. "Guilty plea to simple theft, restitution for all stolen items, dismissal of the other charges. No jail time, probation only." I started to object, but Patricia held up a hand. "We'll consider it," she said. "But any plea agreement would have to include complete withdrawal of the civil challenge to Mr. Chen's will, and full restitution not just for the stolen items, but for all legal fees Mrs. Chen has incurred defending against frivolous claims." As we walked out of the courthouse, the preliminary hearing had revealed the full scope of my mother's betrayal, but it had also revealed the strength of the community that surrounded me. Mrs. Chen's loyalty, David's father's love, Detective Santos's professionalism, Patricia's fierce advocacy, all of it had created a web of support that my mother's actions couldn't tear apart. "What happens now?" I asked Patricia as we reached our cars. "Now we wait for her to decide whether she wants to plead guilty or go to trial. Either way, we've won the important battle. The truth is out there now, documented and witnessed. She can't rewrite history anymore." That evening, I sat in David's garden one more time, watching the last of the season's sunflowers turn their faces toward the setting sun. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of rebuilding, not just my home, but my understanding of what family meant, what love looked like, what justice required. My mother had tried to sell my wedding dress because she thought it was just fabric and memories, something that could be reduced to a price tag and forgotten. But she'd been wrong about everything. Love wasn't a commodity, marriage wasn't a transaction, and some things became more precious when someone tried to destroy them. The real wedding dress, the love it represented, the vows it symbolized, the life it commemorated, that dress could never be stolen or sold. It lived in the house David and I had shared, in the garden he'd planted for me, in the family that had chosen me and continued to protect me, even after he was gone. My mother would face the consequences of her choices, but I would face the future knowing that love, real love, was worth fighting for, no matter what it cost. The plea negotiations took 3 weeks, conducted through lawyers in sterile conference rooms that smelled of coffee and legal documents. Robert Finch presented a series of offers, each one slightly more favorable to me than the last, as the reality of my mother's situation became increasingly clear. "She's scared," Patricia explained after the 4th round of negotiations. "The financial records we uncovered show that she's already spent most of her savings on legal fees. If this goes to trial and she's convicted on all charges, she's looking at significant jail time and civil liability that could bankrupt her completely." I was watering David's sunflowers, now dried and heavy with seeds for next year's planting, when Patricia called with the final offer. My mother would plead guilty to theft and fraud charges, would serve 6 months of home detention followed by 2 years of probation, and would pay full restitution for all stolen items plus all of my legal fees. Most importantly, she would withdraw her challenge to David's will completely and irrevocably. "She also wants to include a personal letter of apology," Patricia said. "Finch claims she's genuinely remorseful and wants to make amends." "I don't want her apology," I said immediately. "I want her to face the consequences of her actions and leave me alone." "You don't have to accept the apology, Sarah. But you should know that this offer represents everything we could realistically hope to achieve. Complete vindication, full restitution, and an end to the civil case that's been draining your resources for months." I spent that evening walking through the house David and I had shared, touching the empty spaces where my stolen possessions had been, trying to imagine them filled again with the objects that had made this place a home. The pearl necklace would go back in my jewelry box, the antique quilt would return to the guest room bed, the wedding china would fill the kitchen cabinets once more. But something had changed in me during these months of fighting. The objects themselves mattered less than they once had. What mattered was the principle, the recognition that love couldn't be stolen, and memories couldn't be sold. that my marriage to David had value that no legal challenge could diminish. Mrs. Chen knocked on my door the next morning, carrying a pot of tea and wearing the gentle expression that had become her trademark since David's death. We sat in the kitchen where David had made breakfast every morning, where we'd planned our days and shared our dreams and argued about whose turn it was to do the dishes. "You look different," she said, studying my face with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd spent 40 years teaching children to read not just books but emotions. "Stronger, more settled." "I feel different, like I finally understand what I'm fighting for." "And what is that?" I thought about her question, really considered it. The right to define my own life. The right to honor the love David and I shared without having it judged or diminished by people who never understood it. The right to grieve and heal and move forward on my own terms. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "David would be proud of you. He always said you were stronger than you realized, that you just needed the right circumstances to discover it." "I miss him," I said, and it was true, but the missing had changed over these months. It was still there, still sharp sometimes, but it no longer felt like drowning. It felt like carrying something precious, something worth protecting. "Of course you do. Love like that doesn't disappear just because the person is gone. It becomes part of who you are." I accepted the plea agreement the next day, signing documents in Patricia's office while rain drummed against the windows and the November wind rattled the glass. My mother would be sentenced in 2 weeks. The restitution payments would begin immediately. The civil case would be dismissed with prejudice, meaning she could never challenge David's will again. "What will you do now?" Patricia asked as we finished the paperwork. "Live my life," I said simply. "For the first time in months, I can think about the future, instead of just surviving the present." The sentencing hearing was brief, almost anticlimactic after months of legal drama. My mother appeared before Judge Morrison wearing a gray dress that made her look older and frailer than I remembered. She read a prepared statement accepting responsibility for her actions. But it felt hollow, rehearsed, like lines delivered by an actress who didn't quite believe in her role. "I love my daughter," she said, not looking at me, "and I thought I was acting in her best interests. I realize now that I was wrong, and I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions." Judge Morrison was having none of it. "Mrs. Mitchell, the evidence in this case shows a pattern of calculated criminal behavior designed to undermine your daughter's legal rights and emotional well-being. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment. It was a sustained campaign of theft and deception that you funded by selling your daughter's most precious possessions." She sentenced my mother to the agreed-upon terms: home detention, probation, restitution, but added something that wasn't part of the plea agreement. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm also ordering you to undergo counseling to address the behavioral patterns that led to these crimes. Your actions suggest someone who has difficulty respecting boundaries and accepting other people's right to make their own choices. That's not a legal problem. It's a personal one that needs professional attention." My mother's face flushed with embarrassment, but she nodded stiffly and accepted the additional requirement. As the court adjourned, she looked at me one final time, and I saw something in her expression that might have been hope. Hope that this could be the beginning of some kind of reconciliation, some return to the fractured relationship we'd always had. But I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no desire for revenge or reconciliation. Just a vast emptiness where my filial obligations used to be, and underneath that, something that felt like relief. I walked out of the courthouse alone. Patricia had offered to accompany me, but I'd wanted to face this moment by myself, to feel what it was like to be free of my mother's influence for the first time in my adult life. The December air was crisp and clean, full of the promise of snow, and I breathed it in deeply as I walked to my car. The first restitution check arrived a week later, along with my wedding dress, carefully cleaned and preserved in acid-free tissue paper. I hung it in the closet next to the simple black dress I'd worn to David's funeral. 2 bookends of grief and joy, endings and beginnings. Over the following weeks, my stolen possessions returned one by one. The pearl necklace, polished and restrung, went back in my jewelry box next to David's wedding ring. The antique quilt returned to the guest room, where it would wait for visitors who might never come but whose potential presence made the house feel more hopeful. The wedding china filled the kitchen cabinets, ready for celebrations I couldn't yet imagine but was learning to believe in again. But the most meaningful return wasn't an object at all. It was the insurance check from Metropolitan Life, finally released after months of legal battles. David's final gift to me, his promise that I would be taken care of, even after he was gone. I deposited it on a Thursday morning in January, watching the numbers appear on my account balance like a message from beyond. Not just money, but vindication, proof that our love had legal weight and moral force. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since before David's death. I went shopping for pleasure rather than necessity, walking through the downtown district where we'd spent Saturday mornings browsing bookstores and antique shops. I bought fresh flowers for the kitchen table, a new novel by an author David had loved, a bottle of wine expensive enough to celebrate with. At home, I arranged the flowers in the crystal vase we'd received as a wedding gift, opened the wine, and sat in David's chair by the window, where he used to grade papers and plan lessons. The sunflower seeds he'd planted were dormant now, sleeping through the winter, but I could see the promise of spring in the carefully prepared soil, in the fence he'd mended to protect next year's growth. Mrs. Chen knocked on the door just as the sun was setting, carrying a covered dish and wearing the smile that had become my anchor through the darkest months of this ordeal. "I brought dinner," she said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become hers by default over the past year. "And I wanted to tell you something. David's father called me this morning. He and Mrs. Chen want to come visit next month, to see how you're doing, to spend some time in the house where David was happy." The thought of David's parents returning filled me with unexpected joy. They'd been here only once since the funeral, and their grief had been so raw, so overwhelming, that the visit had felt more like a wake than a celebration of David's life. But time had passed, wounds had begun to heal, and perhaps we were all ready to remember him with more joy than sorrow. "I'd like that," I said. "I'd like them to see the garden when it starts blooming again, to know that I'm taking care of the things he planted." "They know, dear, we all know. You fought so hard to protect his memory, to honor what you built together. He would be so proud of the woman you've become." Over the winter months, I began to rebuild not just my possessions but my sense of self. I returned to work at the public library where I'd been employed before David's death, where my colleagues had held my position and covered my responsibilities during the worst of the legal battles. It felt good to be useful again, to help other people find the books and information they needed, to be part of a community that existed for something larger than individual grief or gain. I started volunteering at the elementary school where David had taught, helping with the after-school reading program he'd founded 3 years earlier. The children remembered him with the casual acceptance of the young Mr. Chen, who had made learning fun, who had believed they were all capable of greatness, who had left them too soon but not before planting seeds that continued to grow. "He talked about you all the time," said Maria Santos, David's former teaching partner, who had become the program coordinator. "He used to say that marrying you was like finding the other half of his soul, that you made him braver and kinder and more hopeful about the future." Working with David's students gave me a sense of continuity, of purpose that extended beyond my own healing. These children carried pieces of him forward into the world: his enthusiasm for learning, his belief in their potential, his conviction that education could change lives. Through them, David's influence would ripple outward for decades, touching lives he would never meet, solving problems he would never see. Spring arrived early that year, with daffodils blooming in February and the first green shoots of David's sunflowers appearing in March. I worked in the garden every weekend, preparing the soil, planting new varieties alongside David's original seeds, creating something that honored the past while embracing the possibility of growth. David's parents arrived in April, when the garden was just beginning to show its promise. They'd aged since the funeral, but they seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the weight of sudden loss. We spent their visit walking through the house David and I had shared, looking at photographs and talking about memories that no longer felt too painful to examine. "He was so happy here," Mrs. Chen said as we sat on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the blooming cherry tree David had planted for our first anniversary. "This house, this life you built together, it was everything he'd ever dreamed of." "I know," I said, and for the first time in almost a year I could say it without crying. We were both happy, and that happiness was real, no matter what happened after. Mr. Chen reached over and patted my hand with the gentle affection that had made me feel like a true daughter from the moment I joined their family. You know, dear, David always said that love was the only thing that gets stronger when you give it away. We see that in you now. The way you've shared his memory with his students, the way you've fought to protect what you built together. You're still giving his love to the world. That summer, I made a decision that surprised even me. I started dating again. Not seriously, not with any expectation of replacing what David and I had shared, but with a growing recognition that I was still alive, still capable of connection and growth and even joy. His name was Michael Torres, and he was a librarian at the State University, a quiet man with kind eyes, who understood that grief was not something to be fixed or hurried past, but something to be honored and integrated into a life that continued to have meaning. He'd lost his first wife to cancer 5 years earlier, and he carried his own memories with the same careful tenderness I brought to mine. We took our relationship slowly, building friendship before romance, establishing trust before vulnerability. He never tried to replace David or compete with his memory. Instead, he seemed to understand that loving me meant accepting all of who I was, including the part that would always belong to my first husband. Love isn't a finite resource, he said one evening as we walked through downtown Millfield, past the church where David and I had been married, past the coffee shop where David had proposed. Loving David doesn't make you less capable of loving someone else. It makes you more capable, because it taught you what real love looks like. The first anniversary of David's death passed quietly, marked by a memorial service at the school, where his colleagues and students gathered to share stories and plant a tree in the courtyard where he'd often eaten lunch. I spoke briefly about the man who had loved learning and children and life itself with an enthusiasm that death couldn't diminish. David believed that we honor the people we love not by stopping our lives when they end, but by living more fully because they were part of our story, I told the gathered crowd. He would want his death to be a comma in the sentence of our lives, not a period. As the school year ended and summer began, I found myself thinking less about what I'd lost and more about what I'd gained through the experience of fighting for it. I'd discovered reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed, had learned to distinguish between love and manipulation, had built a community of support that extended far beyond biological family. My mother sent me a birthday card that year, the first communication we'd had since her sentencing. It was a generic card with a generic message, signed simply Mother, as if the events of the past year had been some kind of temporary misunderstanding rather than a fundamental betrayal of trust. I threw it away without a second thought. The woman who had raised me no longer existed in my life, except as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when love became conditional and family became a weapon. I felt no anger toward her anymore, but I also felt no obligation to maintain a relationship that had been toxic from the beginning. Instead, I focused on the family I'd chosen, Mrs. Chen, who continued to bring me dinner and wisdom in equal measure. David's parents, who called every week and visited every few months. Jessica, who had stood by me through the darkest period of my life. The colleagues and students and friends who had formed a web of support that proved family was not defined by blood, but by choice, in commitment, and love. By the second anniversary of David's death, I was ready to make changes that once would have felt like betrayal. I sold the house on Maple Street, not because I was running from the memories it held, but because I was ready to create new ones somewhere else. Michael and I had been talking about marriage, about building a life together that honored our past while embracing our future. The house sold to a young couple with 2 small children, teachers like David had been, dreamers who saw in the Victorian cottage the same potential for happiness that David and I had discovered. I left them the sunflower seeds from David's garden, along with instructions for care and a note explaining their significance. These flowers taught me that some things become more beautiful when they're shared, I wrote. I hope they bring your family as much joy as they brought mine. The closing took place on a bright September morning exactly 2 years after my mother's arrest. As I signed the final papers and handed over the keys, I felt not loss but completion, the satisfying weight of a chapter ending and a new one beginning. I used part of the proceeds to establish the David Chen Memorial Scholarship Fund at the local college, providing financial aid for students pursuing education degrees. The first recipient was Maria Santos's daughter, a young woman who wanted to teach elementary school because she remembered how Mr. Chen had made her love learning when she was 8 years old. "It's perfect," Patricia said when I called to tell her about the scholarship. "David's love for teaching, continuing to change lives long after he's gone. He would be so proud of what you've built from this tragedy." Michael and I were married the following spring, in a simple ceremony at the Botanical Garden where David and I had often walked on Sunday afternoons. I wore a new dress, but I also wore David's grandmother's pearl necklace, returned to me through legal battles, but kept by choice as a symbol of the family that had embraced me and continued to love me even as I built a new life. Mrs. Chen served as my matron of honor, and David's parents walked me down the aisle because they insisted that I was still their daughter, that marriage to Michael didn't diminish my place in their family but expanded it to include him as well. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by the people who had supported me through the darkest period of my life and who now celebrated with me as I stepped into a brighter future. There were no family disputes, no legal challenges, no conditions or manipulations, just love, freely given and gratefully received. As Michael and I exchanged vows, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the grief and betrayal and legal battles that had stripped away everything I thought I knew about family and love, revealing the bedrock of truth beneath. Real love didn't diminish when shared, didn't become less valuable when tested, didn't die even when the person who embodied it was gone. The reception was held at the library where Michael and I both worked. Among the books and stories that had brought us together, Mrs. Chen gave a toast that made everyone cry, talking about the love that had sustained David and me, the courage that had carried me through the battles that followed, and the hope that now blessed my future with Michael. "Love is the only investment that pays dividends even after you spend the principal," she said, raising her glass to the assembled crowd. Sarah learned that lesson the hard way, but she learned it completely, and now she's sharing those dividends with all of us. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I stood in the library's garden with Michael, watching the sun set over the town that had become home in ways I'd never expected. Millfield had seen me at my lowest point, and had offered support without judgment, had witnessed my battles and celebrated my victories, had proved that community was something you built rather than something you inherited. "Are you happy?" Michael asked, his arm around my waist, his voice gentle with concern for the complexity of emotions that any major transition brought. "I'm happy," I said, and it was true in a way that would have surprised me 2 years earlier. Not the same kind of happy I was with David, but a different kind, deeper maybe. More aware of how precious it is, how much it's worth fighting for. The last guests departed as the stars appeared overhead, the same stars that had witnessed my wedding to David, my mother's betrayal, the legal battles that had nearly destroyed me, and now this new beginning that felt both familiar and completely fresh. I locked up the library and walked home with Michael to the apartment we'd rented together, carrying flowers from the reception and a heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this place. Tomorrow we would begin our married life together, building something new on the foundation of lessons learned through loss and struggle, and the kind of love that grows stronger when tested. But tonight I wanted to sit quietly and remember how it felt to have fought for love and won, to have defended the value of marriage against those who would reduce it to a transaction, to have learned that some things, the most important things, truly cannot be stolen or sold or diminished by those who don't understand their worth. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a law firm I'd never heard of in a city 3 states away. Inside I found notification that my mother had died of a stroke at age 75, alone in the assisted living facility where she'd moved after completing her court-ordered home detention. I read the letter twice, waiting for some emotion to surface: grief, relief, anger, regret. But I felt only a distant sadness for a life that had been defined by bitterness and control, for opportunities for love and connection that had been squandered in pursuit of being right rather than being happy. Henderson. Michael found me sitting at our kitchen table with the letter in my hands, staring out the window at the garden where I'd planted sunflowers in honor of David's memory. Our daughter Emma, now 3 years old, was playing in the backyard with blocks that her grandfather Chen had made for her, building structures with the same careful attention to detail that David had brought to his lesson plans. "Bad news?" Michael asked, settling into the chair beside me with the gentle concern that had become his trademark over our 4 years of marriage. "My mother died," I said simply, 3 weeks ago. They've been trying to locate me to discuss her will. Michael knew the whole story, of course. I told him about the wedding dress and the stolen heirlooms, about the legal battles and the criminal charges, about the family relationships that had been severed by greed and manipulation. He'd listened without judgment, had helped me understand that my mother's actions reflected her own wounds rather than my worth as a daughter. "How do you feel?" he asked. Like a chapter is finally closing, but not a chapter I was still reading, if that makes sense. The will, when I received it a week later, was a final act of manipulation disguised as reconciliation. My mother had left me her house and her remaining assets, along with a lengthy letter explaining her actions and requesting forgiveness for the pain she'd caused. "I know I made mistakes," the letter read. "I let my fear for your future cloud my judgment about what was best for you. I hope you can understand that everything I did came from love, even when it didn't feel that way." But love, I'd learned, wasn't about intentions or explanations. Love was about actions, about respect, about supporting someone's right to make their own choices, even when you disagreed with them. My mother had never learned that lesson, had died believing that control was the same thing as care. I donated the house to a local charity that provided transitional housing for domestic violence survivors. It seemed fitting. Turning a place that had harbored bitterness and manipulation into a sanctuary for people learning to rebuild their lives free from abuse and control. The remaining assets, about $40,000 after debts and expenses, I split between the David Chen Memorial Scholarship Fund and a new program I'd started at the library called Stories of Resilience, which provided free counseling and support groups for people dealing with family trauma and complicated grief. "You don't have to forgive her," my therapist, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, said during one of our sessions. "Forgiveness isn't about absolving other people of responsibility for their actions. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of carrying their choices." I'd started therapy 2 years into my marriage to Michael, not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted to make sure I didn't carry my mother's patterns into my own family. Dr. Martinez had helped me understand the difference between healthy boundaries and emotional walls, between self-protection and self-isolation. "I don't think about forgiveness anymore," I told her. "I think about understanding. I understand why she acted the way she did, and I understand why I couldn't accept it." That's enough. Emma Chen Torres was 8 years old when she asked me about the wedding dress hanging in the back of my closet, the ivory silk gown that I'd never worn again but couldn't bring myself to donate or discard. "Why do you have 2 wedding dresses, Mama?" she asked, her small fingers tracing the beaded bodice with the careful reverence children reserve for obviously precious things. "Because I've been married twice," I explained, sitting on the bed in the room Michael and I now shared in the house we'd bought 3 years earlier. "This dress is from when I was married to David, before you were born. He was a wonderful man who would have loved you very much." Emma had grown up knowing about David, seeing his photograph on the mantelpiece, hearing stories about the garden he'd planted and the students he'd taught. He wasn't a secret or a source of awkwardness in our family. He was part of our history, part of the love that had shaped me into the mother and wife I'd become. "Did Daddy Michael know about David when you got married?" "Yes, sweetheart. Daddy Michael knew that David would always be part of my heart, and he was okay with that. Love isn't like a pie that gets smaller when you share it. It's like a candle that can light other candles without dimming itself." It was a lesson I'd learned the hard way, through legal battles and stolen possessions and the kind of family betrayal that either destroys you or teaches you what really matters. I'd chosen to let it teach me, and the lesson had been worth the price. Emma nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the matter-of-fact wisdom of children who've never been taught that love should be complicated or conditional. "Can I try on the dress?" We spent that afternoon playing dress-up, Emma swimming in the ivory silk while I told her stories about the wedding where I'd worn it, about the man who'd cried when he saw me walking down the aisle, about the life we'd built together in the house with the sunflower garden. "Will you give me this dress when I get married?" Emma asked, posing in front of the mirror with the cathedral train pooled around her feet. "If you want it," I said, "but only if you're marrying someone who loves you the way David loved me and the way Daddy Michael loves me now. Someone who thinks you're perfect exactly as you are." "How will I know?" "You'll know because they'll make you feel brave and beautiful and free to be yourself. They'll support your dreams even when they don't understand them. They'll stand up for you when other people try to hurt you. And they'll love your family. Not just the family you're born into, but the family you choose." That evening, I called Mrs. Chen, now 83, and still living independently in the small house, next to what had once been mine and David's. She'd become Emma's honorary grandmother, teaching her to cook Chinese dishes and sharing stories about the uncle she'd never met, but whose influence shaped her life in countless small ways. I told Emma about the wedding dress today, I said, about David, about the life we had together. How did she react? Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like of course I would have loved someone before I met her father, and of course that love would still be part of who I am. Mrs. Chen chuckled softly. Children understand love better than adults do sometimes. They haven't learned yet that it's supposed to be complicated. The David Chen Memorial Scholarship Fund had grown into something larger than I'd ever imagined. What started as a modest endowment had become a foundation that provided full college scholarships to dozens of students each year, all of them pursuing careers in education. I served on the board of directors alongside David's former colleagues, his parents who'd moved back to California but remained deeply involved, and several of his former students who'd become teachers themselves and wanted to pay forward the inspiration he'd given them. The annual scholarship dinner was held each spring at the school where David had taught, in the cafeteria where he'd supervised lunch duty, and the gymnasium where he'd coached the academic decathlon team. Former students, now adults with children of their own, returned each year to share stories about the teacher who'd believed in them when they didn't believe in themselves. Mr. Chen taught me that being smart wasn't something to be ashamed of, said Maria Santos, now Dr. Maria Santos, a professor of education at the State University. He made learning feel like an adventure instead of a chore. When I decided to become a teacher myself, it was because I wanted to give other kids what he'd given me. This year's keynote speaker was unexpected. Rebecca Morrison, the judge who had sentenced my mother 15 years earlier. She'd retired from the bench and become an advocate for victims of elder abuse and family financial exploitation, traveling the country to speak about the cases that had shaped her understanding of how love could be weaponized by those who didn't understand its true nature. I've seen hundreds of family disputes in my courtroom, she told the gathered crowd. Cases where inheritance turned siblings against each other, where grief was manipulated for financial gain, where love was treated like a commodity to be bought and sold. But I've also seen cases like Sarah Chen's, where someone fought not for money but for the right to honor love in all its forms. She looked directly at me as she continued. What made Sarah's case special wasn't just that she won, but how she won. She could have become bitter, could have let her mother's betrayal poison her ability to trust and love again. Instead, she used that experience to build something beautiful. This foundation, her work with trauma survivors, her own family that models healthy love for her daughter. She turned theft into generosity, betrayal into wisdom, loss into legacy. After the dinner, I walked through the school hallways where David had once taught, past classrooms filled with his former students' artwork and achievements. In the library, there was a reading corner dedicated to his memory, comfortable chairs surrounded by books he'd recommended and stories he'd shared with countless children over the years. Emma, now 18 and preparing for college herself, found me there. She'd grown into a thoughtful young woman with David's love of learning and Michael's gentle nature, along with something uniquely her own, a fierce sense of justice that I like to think she'd inherited from watching me fight for what mattered. I've been thinking about what Judge Morrison said, Emma told me as we sat in David's reading corner. About how you turned what happened with Grandma Margaret into something positive. I want to do something like that too. What do you mean? I want to study law, not to fight over money like she did, but to help people like you, people whose families hurt them, who need someone to stand up for their right to live their own lives. I felt a surge of pride, mixed with the bittersweet recognition that my daughter had learned lessons I'd wished I'd never had to teach. She'd grown up seeing the aftermath of family dysfunction, but instead of becoming cynical, she'd become committed to helping others heal from similar wounds. Law school is challenging, I said, and family law can be emotionally difficult. You'll see people at their worst, fighting over children and property and principles. I know, but I also see what happened when you found the right lawyer, when you had someone who really understood what you were fighting for. Patricia Mendez didn't just win your case. She helped you reclaim your life. I want to do that for other people. Michael and I were sitting on the porch of our house on the evening of our 20th wedding anniversary, watching Emma play with her own daughter in the yard where sunflowers still bloomed every summer. 4-year-old Grace was a miniature version of her mother, with the same dark hair and thoughtful eyes, but with an added sparkle of mischief that suggested she'd inherited her grandfather Michael's sense of humor. Emma had indeed become a lawyer, specializing in family law and victims' rights. She'd married Daniel Kim, a fellow attorney she'd met during law school, in a ceremony that honored both families' traditions while creating new ones of their own. Their wedding had been held in the botanical garden where Michael and I had been married, with Mrs. Chen, now 93 but still sharp as a tack, serving as flower girl at her own insistence. "Do you ever regret it?" Michael asked, his hand finding mine in the comfortable silence of a couple who'd learned to communicate as much through touch as through words. "Fighting so hard for David's memory? Putting yourself through all that legal trauma?" I considered the question, watching Grace chase fireflies in the gathering dusk while Emma supervised from the garden swing David had originally built for me. The house was filled with 3 generations of love, photographs from both my weddings, artwork from Grace's preschool class, David's books on the shelves next to Michael's, Mrs. Chen's quilt draped over the couch where all of us gathered for Sunday dinners. "No," I said finally. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it. Everything good in our life now grew from that decision to fight for love instead of accepting defeat. Even Emma's career choice?" I laughed. "Especially Emma's career choice. She's helped dozens of families navigate situations like ours, helped people understand that they don't have to accept toxic relationships just because they're biological. She's made the world a little bit safer for people who choose love over obligation." Emma had established her own practice 5 years earlier, taking on cases that larger firms avoided because they were emotionally complex or financially unrewarding. She specialized in helping victims of family financial abuse, in protecting people's right to make their own choices about marriage and children and inheritance. "She saved my life," one of her clients had told me at a community event the previous month. "My mother was trying to force me to divorce my husband because she didn't approve of his race. She was threatening to disinherit me, to cut me off from the family, to make sure my children never knew their grandparents. Emma helped me understand that I had choices, that love was more important than money or approval. It was the same lesson I'd learned 2 decades earlier, the same understanding that had cost me my relationship with my mother but had saved my relationship with myself." As the sun set behind the trees David had planted, and Michael had nurtured, and Grace would someday climb, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life lived with intention. The wedding dress still hung in our closet, no longer a symbol of theft and betrayal but a reminder of the love that had started this journey, the marriage that had taught me what was worth fighting for. "Will you tell Grace about David when she's older?" Michael asked. "Of course. He's part of her story too, part of the love that shaped her mother and grandmother. She deserves to know about the uncle who loved teaching and planting flowers and believing in people's potential. And about your mother? That too. She needs to understand that family can be complicated, that love sometimes comes with conditions that aren't worth accepting. But mostly, she needs to know that she has choices, that she can build the kind of family she wants rather than accepting the one she inherits." Grace ran up to the porch as the streetlights began to flicker on, her small hands cupped around a firefly she'd managed to catch. "Look, Grandma Sarah, I caught a light." "Beautiful, sweetheart. But you know what? If you let it go, it can find its family and make more light with them." Grace considered this seriously, then opened her hands and watched the firefly spiral up into the darkness, its glow joining the dozens of others dancing in the warm air. "There," she said with satisfaction. "Now it's happier." "How do you know?" Emma asked, settling beside us on the porch steps with the easy grace of someone who'd grown up feeling secure in her place in the world. "Because being with your family is better than being caught by yourself," Grace said with the simple wisdom of childhood. "Even if your family is different from other people's families." I looked around at the family gathered on this porch. Michael with his quiet strength, Emma with her fierce compassion, Grace with her innocent insight, And, in the distance, Mrs. Chen's house, where a light still burned in the window of the woman who'd become more of a mother to me than the one who'd given me birth. This was the family I'd chosen, the family I'd fought for, the family that had grown from the seeds of love that David had planted and that had survived every attempt to destroy them. It wasn't the family my mother had envisioned for me, but it was the family that honored the best parts of who I was while helping me become who I was meant to be. The final letter in this story arrived on the morning of my 70th birthday, delivered not by a law firm but by Emma, who'd driven over early to help me prepare for the party Michael was throwing that evening. She found me in the garden, tending the sunflowers that had become a tradition, a connection to David that transcended death and legal battles and the passage of time. "Mom, I have something for you," she said, settling beside me on the bench Michael had built to replace the one David had originally made. "Something I've been working on for months." She handed me a thick folder bound with ribbon, the kind of presentation that suggested official importance. Inside, I found documents establishing the Sarah Chen Foundation for Family Justice, endowed with funds from Emma's law practice and designed to provide legal services for victims of family financial abuse. "Emma," I breathed, reading through the articles of incorporation, the mission statement, the board of directors that included Patricia Mendez, now retired but still passionate about justice, Detective Santos, now chief of police, and several other people who'd played important roles in my own journey toward healing. "I wanted to honor what you taught me," Emma said. "That sometimes fighting for love means fighting against family, and that's okay. That justice isn't just about punishment. It's about protection and healing, and making sure other people don't have to go through what you went through." The foundation would provide free legal services, counseling support, and financial assistance to people whose families were manipulating or exploiting them. It would help victims of elder abuse, adult children being financially manipulated by parents, spouses being isolated from their support networks by controlling in-laws. "There's one more thing," Emma said, pulling out a final document. "I want you to be the first recipient of the Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award for showing the rest of us that love is worth fighting for, no matter what it costs." I held the certificate in my hands, reading the inscription, "To Sarah Chen, who transformed personal tragedy into community healing, who chose love over bitterness, who proved that some things are too precious to be stolen or sold." That evening, surrounded by friends and family in the backyard where David's sunflowers towered over tables filled with food and laughter, I stood to make a toast. Grace, now 29 and a teacher like the uncles she'd never met, had brought her own children, twin boys who were chasing fireflies just as she had 25 years earlier. "I want to thank all of you for being here," I said, raising my glass to the assembled crowd, "for being the family I chose, the family that chose me back, the family that proved love is something you build rather than something you inherit." I looked out at faces that had sustained me through the darkest period of my life and celebrated with me through all the bright moments that followed. Mrs. Chen, now 98, and still insisting on bringing homemade dumplings to every gathering. Patricia Mendez and her husband, who'd become dear friends long after our legal relationship ended. Detective Santos, who'd sent me a Christmas card every year for 25 years with updates on her own family and career. 25 years ago, someone I trusted betrayed that trust in the cruelest way possible. She tried to steal not just my possessions but my memories, my right to grieve and heal on my own terms, my belief that love could survive anything. She thought she could force me to accept her version of my life by making it impossible for me to live my own. But she was wrong about everything. She was wrong about David, wrong about our marriage, wrong about what love looks like and how it works. Most importantly, she was wrong about me. She thought I would break under the pressure, that I would choose the easy path of accepting her control, rather than fighting for my right to live authentically. I paused, looking at Michael, at Emma, at Grace's children playing in the garden where love had literally taken root and bloomed year after year. Instead, I learned that real love, the kind worth having, makes you stronger, not weaker. It gives you the courage to fight for what matters, the wisdom to know the difference between family and biology, the strength to build something beautiful from even the most painful experiences. The applause was warm and sustained, but what mattered more were the tears I saw in several faces, the recognition that everyone had their own battles with family expectations and conditional love. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Grace's 7-year-old son tugged on my sleeve. "Grandma Grace, Sarah, will you tell us the story about the wedding dress again? I looked down at him, this beautiful boy who carried forward the legacy of love that David had started, that I had protected, that Emma had transformed into service to others, that would continue rippling outward through generations yet to come. Of course, sweetheart. But remember the most important part. Love isn't something that can be stolen or sold. It lives in our choices, our courage, and our commitment to protecting what matters most. As I tucked the children into bed that night, sharing once again the story of the wedding dress that had been sold but not lost, stolen but not destroyed, I realized that this was how real love works. It survives every attempt to diminish it, grows stronger when tested, and creates something lasting that no amount of greed or manipulation can ever truly take away. The wedding dress still hangs in our closet, no longer a symbol of betrayal, but a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what it costs. And every spring, when David's sunflowers bloom in our garden, I remember that love, real love, always finds a way to grow. Subscribe to my channel, where silence is never forgotten.